The assassination that tests ties between Russia and Turkey. Both say the shooting of the Russian ambassador in Ankara won't derail their reconciliation. But what are the long-term implications and how does it affect the war in Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. They are on opposing sides of the war in Syria and have had a rocky relationship. But relations between Russia and Turkey seem to be improving recently now that budding friendship may be back on the rocks. Russia's ambassador to Turkey was shot and killed in Ankara on Monday. The gunman was an off-duty Turkish policeman who said he was angry about Russia's alleged war crimes in Syria. Both the Turkish and Russian presidents say they won't let the assassination affect relations.
We know this is a provocation aimed specifically at hurting the relationship between Turkey and Russia. The Russian government and the Turkish government won't rise to the bait.
This crime is undoubtedly a provocation aimed at derailing the ties between Russia and Turkey, as well as the peace process in Syria, which is actively promoted by Russia, Turkey, Iran, and other countries interested in the resolution of the Syrian conflict. There's only one possible response to this: the strengthening of the fight against terror. And the bandits will feel it themselves.
So similar sentiments from Putin and Erdogan there, but they've not always been on the same page. They've been at odds over Syria for years. The Turkish government opposes President Bashar al-Assad while Russia supports him. Last year, the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian warplane. One of its pilots was killed. President Erdogan said Turkey had the right to defend airspace violations. Russia imposed economic sanctions which hurt the Turkish economy, especially tourism, construction and bilateral trade. Relations began healing in June after Erdogan officially apologized for the downing of the Russian jet, and he met Putin during a visit to St. Petersburg in August. The attempted military coup in Turkey in July made Erdogan suspicious of the West, making Putin a more viable ally. And most recently, Turkish and Russian diplomats worked together to broker a ceasefire to end fighting in Aleppo last week. Well, let's now bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. In Istanbul, we have Turkish journalist and author Mustafa Akyol. In London, William Patey is a former career ambassador at the UK Foreign Office who also served as the head of Middle East policy. And in Moscow, international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Mark, in Moscow, if I can start with you. While both Russia and Turkey have said the assassination of Ambassador Karlov would not derail reconciliation, we heard a typically strong response from President Putin, who said there can only be one answer, and that is stepping up the fight against terrorism. How might Russia retaliate after this assassination?
Well, that all depends on what is uncovered in the investigation. And there is already a team of some Russian, 18 Russian investigators on the ground in Turkey that are supposed to coordinate with their Turkish counterparts. There's the question of whether this person was a lone terrorist, radicalized by the Turkish regime's proxy war on Syria for the last 16 years in support of Islamists and jihadists in the country, or whether he is part of a group or network. And there is some indications that this may be the case. There was a similar incident last night outside the U.S. embassy, according to some reports in Turkey. A gunman tried to gain access to the U.S. embassy. This might indicate a group effort.
Right, but it's still early days, of course, Mark. We can't speculate as to what the motivations are right now. I'm just asking you about how might this affect the Turkish-Russia relationship. Do you see it having a negative impact on the relationship that had been improving?
No, in the short term, I see that both the Kremlin and Ankara will try to brush this incident under the carpet. They are both continuing a geopolitical dance, Turkish for economic reasons, Russia towards trying to get Turkey to close its border and end the wars in Syria. So I don't see this as derailing relations. Some have even speculated it may improve them. I'm skeptical of that. But at the least, I think we'll try to see this incident papered over and I don't know if we'll ever get any clear answers.
Okay, let's bring in Mustafa Akyol in Istanbul. Mustafa, your thoughts? I mean, President Erdogan and Putin have both reiterated their intent to maintain strong ties, but there is clearly anger within Turkish society about Russia's role in Syria. Before this assassination, a day before it, there were protests in Turkey over Russia's role in Syria. How is the Turkish government going to handle this?
Well, first, condolences to the Russians for their loss in Ankara. I mean, the assassination of the ambassador has been condemned by all political actors in Turkey, from the government to the opposition. Nobody supports that. But it is true that indeed there is anger in Turkish society over Russia because of its own proxy war in Syria, which includes heavily arming and politically supporting, diplomatically supporting the Assad regime, which has been bombing its own people with barrel bombs and leading to mass casualties lately in Aleppo. So this gunman who assassinated the Russian ambassador could have been radicalized by looking at the news of Syria. I mean, he shouted slogans about paying the price for Aleppo. So it is possible that he could be moved by the suffering in Syria, but then, of course, did the unthinkable crime of attacking a civilian diplomat, which is totally unacceptable. But the Turkish government has a different, actually, narrative right now. The government says that the gunman was not radicalized. He was actually a saboteur on Turkish-Russian relationship. They're pointing to the possible links with the Gülen network, the secretive network within the state, within the police. And if that argument holds, this incident can actually be something that can bring Russia and Turkey even closer, although they have very different positions still on the ground when you come to Syria.
It is interesting indeed, Mustafa. The reaction from pro-government Turkish papers today has been a very interesting one. They say that the Gülenists, the supporters of the exiled cleric Fethullah Gülen, who Turkey accuses of being behind the failed coup attempt in July, are behind this. They say they and the CIA did this. Is that a convincing argument for Turks? Does that resonate with people in Turkey?
Well, that certainly resonates with the people who support the government. I mean, and I think a lot of people in Turkey agree that the Gülen network in the state committed many crimes, including the latest coup attempt. However, using this to explain every political phenomena which we're seeing these days is not convincing to everybody. On the other hand, when you look at Syrian opposition, when you look at Turkish opposition, they would insist that this was a radical Islamist, radicalized, looking at Syrian events. So not everybody agrees with that. But I think Turkish government will keep on insisting that this was a sabotage on Turkey's rapprochement with Russia, which shows you that Turkey is actually willing very much to keep its relationship with Russia going and not go back to the months of Cold War after the downing of the Russian plane. That is partly because Turkey feels a little isolated in the world right now. President Erdogan and his government don't have great relationship with the West. They see Russia now as an ally.
Let's bring in William Patey in London and get his view on this. William Patey, do you think the assassination of Ambassador Karlov will have a significant impact on the diplomatic relations between Turkey and Russia, most notably over Syria right now? There's a fragile ceasefire that they've agreed to in Aleppo. Do you think it will have an impact on the ceasefire? Could we see it collapse?
I don't think so. I think both sides, the early indications are that both sides will seek to almost hesitate to use the word exploit the tragic murder of my ambassadorial colleague to continue the path of rapprochement. The meeting that had already been set up between the Turkish, Russian and Iranian foreign ministers to meet today in Moscow has gone ahead. They are using that to try and broker some sort of longer-term deal in Syria. I think the Russians may be beginning to adjust their position in Syria a bit, having secured the survival of Assad and managed to take Aleppo. They could be looking for to stabilize the situation and not get sucked into a long, drawn-out conflict. And the Turks themselves have priorities higher than getting rid of Assad, and that is to make sure that the Kurds didn't have a contiguous area along the border. So Russian agreement to the Turks to take Al-Bab, a crucial town that would prevent the Kurds from doing this, you can see the beginnings of some practical cooperation here.
Russia clearly has had the upper hand in Syria lately, especially in Aleppo. Do you think this assassination makes its position even stronger and Turkey's even weaker?
I don't think it has a huge impact, if I'm honest, because I think the Turks and the Russians will be able to join together in condemning this, whether the Turks can pin it on Gulenis or not. But they have cooperated very clearly with the Russians. They've accepted an 18-man investigative team. So they're working closely with the Russians. Both Erdogan and Putin have made statements saying they're in the same camp. So I don't see this as leading to a crisis in the relationship. They have a difficult relationship as it is. There are many more things that divide than unite them, but I don't think this will add to their difficulties.
Mark Sloboda in Moscow, Turkey, the Turkish government trying to pin this assassination on the Gulenis. How would Moscow feel about that? And also, do you agree with Mark when he says that this could be perhaps a way out of the Syria crisis for Russia, that they might find a way to make this into a negotiating tactic for them?
Yeah, to answer your second question first, I do think that, the Russian government has extremely skilled diplomatic corps. They will try to use this tragedy for every advantage they can in negotiations with Turkey as they try to pressure them to close their border, stop being a state sponsor of terrorism, and end their long and bloody proxy war on Syria. To answer your first question, I'm not going to answer, for the Kremlin. I'll answer for what many Russians feel as an American veteran and resident, a longtime resident in Russia. The idea that this is done by Gulenists, the bogeyman, the monster under the bed that Erdogan has used to justify his purges on, is frankly an insult to our intelligence. We heard similar, very, very, very post facto accusations that Gulenists were responsible for shooting down the Russian plane on the Syrian-Turkish border after the incidents, and this was treated with a kind of a bitter laugh here. Because Erdogan had previously quite proudly bragged about it and taken credit for it and justified what he did. I don't think that holds any weight here. We heard the perpetrator of this attack during the 15-minute standoff. He quoted almost directly what is kind of the unofficial national anthem of Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham in Syria, which in itself is a quote of the Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden.
Let's allow Mustafa Akyol to respond to what you just said there. Mustafa Akyol, Mark says, Russia views Turkey as a state sponsor of terrorism, and that this gunman, who's described as a 22-year-old riot police officer with so far no links to any groups, is in fact linked to Al-Qaeda, and that basically this is a huge embarrassment for the Turkish government.
Well, I don't agree that Turkey is a sponsor of terrorism. Of course, people have different definitions on terrorism, but I think there is legitimate opposition in Syria since the beginning of the civil war, which of course doesn't include ISIS and al-Nusra as well.
Do you think that Al-Qaeda are terrorists? Do you think that Al-Qaeda are terrorists? Erdogan has been very vague on that issue.
Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization.
Thank you.
Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, and I don't think that the Turkish government supported Al-Qaeda. I think Turkish government supported other groups in Syria. I can name Ahrar al-Sham and other Islamic groups that are not considered as terrorists by either Turkey
or splinter groups of Al-Qaeda.
By either Turkey or by. There can be alliances on the ground. The Kurdish fighters sometimes ally with different groups, but which doesn't make all of them terrorists. And I would personally define terrorism as attacks on civilian population. And if you ask me, Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, ISIS is a terrorist organization, and the Assad regime is a terrorist state whomever attacks innocent civilians are terrorists. And there are, yes, many terrorists in Turkey. If you ask me, Turkey has been the
Erdogan
supporter
kill
of
his
the
own
Syrian
people?
civil war.
Mark,
And
allow
Turkey
him
made
to
mistakes,
finish,
I'll say.
please. Allow him to finish his thoughts. Go ahead, Mustafa.
I would not say that, no. I would say no to your question. Well, I'm critical of President Erdogan for being quite authoritarian on many issues, including freedom of the press. But I would not say Turkey is killing its own people. Turkey is leading a campaign against the PKK, which is a terrorist group which is bombing Turkish cities. And Turkish, yes, military and police are fighting with the PKK. But that's not a conflict that can be compared to the civil war in Syria,
Indeed.
where you have a government, the Assad regime, bombing heavily populated areas with barrel bombs, and which is Russia sponsoring. So I think you cannot compare these things, which doesn't mean that Turkey doesn't make mistakes or have a lot of conspiracy theories that I don't buy as well.
Mustafa, let me just ask you this before we move on.
How Turkish government will move on with this?
Yeah, how will they move on? Do you think this assassination, Mustafa, will be used as an excuse for further repression in Turkey, as we saw in the aftermath of the coup in July?
Well, I agree that every conspiracy theory by the Turkish government is not convincing. And I feel the same thing for this incident as well. But the conspiracy theories of the government are not facts in themselves. And yes, this will probably lead to more arrests of people who are believed to be affiliated with the Gülen network and particularly linked with this attacker. But I think the Turkish government will also understand that there might be people in Turkey radicalized by just looking at the events in Syria, which is the explanation B. And even if the Turkish government pushes one conspiracy theory, I think it will also keep an eye on possibly radicalized people in its midst, which can be a police, which can be a civilian, which feels for the Syrian people. And I should say that people have the right to feel for the Syrian people and to be angry at Russia or Iran for their foreign policy in Syria. But of course, this can never justify any terrorism, the terrorism of the kind that we just saw yesterday in Ankara.
William Patey, I want to hear your thoughts on what these two gentlemen have been debating on. How do you think this is going to impact not just relations between Russia and Turkey over Syria, but all the other actors, non-state and state actors that are involved in Syria's conflict?
Well, I think it's probably a mischaracterization to just accuse Turkey of being a state sponsor of terrorism in Syria. They support the opposition groups, the anti-Assad forces, in the way that the West has and the Gulf states. And some of those groups have close links with terrorist organisations. It's very difficult to differentiate them. But Turkey has been pursuing its own regional interests in Syria in the same way that Russia and Iran have been pursuing their interests. I think these interests may begin to align more now. I think Turkey probably accepts that the West is not going to support the opposition to Assad to the extent that would lead to his downfall. And I imagine the Russians probably accept that Assad regime is not going to be able to impose itself on the whole of Syria. So there is scope there for, at least in the short term, for Turkey and Russia to come to some sort of short-term arrangement in Syria where they freeze the conflict as it is, and the Turks secure their interests in not strengthening the Kurds, and the Russians achieve their influence in Damascus. So I think we could see a congruence of interest.
Is not strengthening the Turks, you think, the ideal arrangement for Turkey right now, William? Because initially they wanted Bashar al-Assad out. Have they given up on that?
Think they had. Well, I think they had three priorities in Syria. One was to make sure the Kurds didn't come out of this in a position to threaten Turkish interests. That was their first interest. The second priority was Assad, and the third priority was Daesh. So I think they're pursuing their first priority. I think they may be accepting the reality that Assad isn't going to go anywhere. So they, on a pragmatic basis, they're not accepting that the Assad is a preference. They may be adjusting to realpolitik.
Okay, let's hear from Mark in Moscow as far as what is Russia's end game in Syria right now. Mark, I mean, they clearly helped the Syrian government win the battle for Aleppo. They're in a strong position right now. Assad is in a strong position thanks to Russia's support. Have the Russians achieved what they intended to achieve when they went into the Syria conflict?
I think they've made a significant milestone. I think we can indeed view the liberation of Aleppo, East Aleppo, from al-Qaeda and friends as a Stalingrad moment in the Syrian conflict. However, the Syrian conflict is far from over. The Wahhabist dictatorships of Qatar and Saudi Arabia have indicated that they will continue to supply arms, to their various jihadi proxies on the ground. Russia, I think the next strategic step is Idlib, which I think every major Western publication agrees is overwhelmingly dominated by
the Syrian government
al-Qaeda.
forces in Idlib, though?
Absolutely. They've already been conducting airstrikes in Idlib, because they haven't actually conducted any airstrikes. They didn't conduct any airstrikes in East Aleppo since October 18th. They've been refocusing their efforts on Idlib and also towards Palmyra, where we saw ISIS march troops across open desert under de facto U.S. and the, quote, anti-ISIS coalition skies without any resistance, without any airstrikes upon them, and re-seize Palmyra, which had been stripped of troops largely for the liberation of East Aleppo. So I think we'll see kind of a two-front next strategic move towards both Palmyra and Idlib. But this is far from over. And ultimately, it will not be over until Erdogan closes the Turkish border and stops illegally arming, training, and paying the salaries, Turkey and its allies,
That's some
jihadists and
some pretty
Islamists
strong
in
accusations that
Syria.
you're making there. Let's hear from Mustafa Akyol in Istanbul about this. Mark says this is not quite over yet. What do you make of what he just said, Mustafa Akyol?
First of all, I don't agree with the Russian language of defining, quote unquote, the liberation of Aleppo from al-Qaeda. Aleppo was occupied by the Syrian regime, which brutally killed innocent civilians, as documented by the United Nations. And now Turkey has been trying to evacuate those civilians, and I'm glad that there has been some cooperation with Russia on that. But to justify the whole brutality of the Assad regime as just a campaign against terrorists, to me, doesn't define the facts on the ground in Syria. Let me put that clear. Secondly, has Turkey made mistakes in the Syrian war? I think so. I think Turkey has made the mistake of believing that a free Syria was possible. If the Assad regime was civilized enough in the very beginning of the civil war, the Assad regime could have declared free elections, and maybe we wouldn't have any of these things in the beginning. Are there groups other than the Assad regime in Syria now that are disturbing, that are threats, that are terrorist forces? Of course. ISIS, number one, al-Qaeda and its affiliates, number two. But this doesn't, again, give the Assad and shouldn't give the Assad regime a blank check to continue committing its human rights violations and as sponsored and supported by Russia and Iran. What Turkey will do? Well, Turkey has realized, I think at the end, that there is a gap between its ideals, its emotions, its ambitions, and with the facts on the ground. Yes, I think Turkish leaders have realized that. And that's why we see now an involvement in Ankara with Russia and Iran as well for finding a peaceful solution to Syrian conflict. And I think that's a good way out, because at the end of the day, like in Bosnia, you can sometimes make peace with monsters like Milosevic, like Assad, just for the sake of peace.
Okay, let's hear from William Patey. You have the final word. What do you see as the best way out of this Syria crisis?
Well, I think the talks in Moscow between the Turks and the Russians and the Iranians probably offer the best hope for some of the Syrian people who have suffered brutally from the Assad regime. And I think Mark's attempt to portray this as the good versus evil, with the Assad on the forces of good and anyone who opposes Assad is supporting terrorism, is to reduce the Syria conflict to simplistic terms that is not there. But I do think that the Syrians have suffered long enough, and anything that offers the prospect of an extended ceasefire ought to be pursued. And I think probably that's realistically what the Moscow meeting offers.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Mustafa Akyol, William Patey and Mark Sloboda, thank you. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Fully Batibo, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.